Hello and welcome to UN Day 2021, a special programme to celebrate the multilateral principle behind the organisation and the founding of the United Nations in 1945, a remarkable development that called for a renewed collective diplomacy between nations after a devastating world war, and which provided hope for people who yearn to be free from the scourge of conflict. Today, although we know that the guns have yet to fall silent in far too many places, there are multiple global emergencies to resolve, not least the Covid-19 pandemic, climate change, rising hunger and poverty, a galloping arms race, terrorism and a lack of sustainable development. It was in front of member states at the General Assembly that the Secretary-General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, made the case for a reinvigorated, more inclusive, networked and effective multilateralism. We have a choice, Mr. Guterres said, break down or break through. And to help humanity move in the right direction, he unveiled a blueprint for international cooperation, our common agenda. To explore the significance of this report as we mark UN Day, we'll be hearing from leading academics and senior UN figures about what major world trends they think the organisation needs to address to help the planet's most vulnerable, more quickly and more effectively than before. Our first guest is Tatiana Valovaya, Director General of the United Nations in Geneva. Ms. Valovaya came into the studio a little earlier, where she explained how UN Day and our common agenda go hand in hand.
Last year, we were celebrating the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, and we had a global conversation about the future we want and the United Nations we need. This year, we already have Secretary General report, our common agenda. And for us here in Geneva, it's exactly an opportunity to discuss how we can participate in implementing this report and making this agenda really common agenda. But also here in Geneva, we have our own celebration, because this year in Geneva, we are celebrating 75th anniversary of our office in Geneva, because it was in 1946 when UN office was established here in Geneva. So for us, it's also an opportunity to look what has been done over these years, but also to see what we can do here, especially in Geneva, in order to implement this common agenda. Geneva is an absolutely unique ecosystem. And the more I work here in the Geneva, more I meet the members, the actors in this unique ecosystem, the member states, represented here by their permanent missions, the international organizations, regional organizations, non-governmental organizations, civil society at large, private sector, academia, institutes, we really here in Geneva can work together and show a certain example of this modern, inclusive and integrated multilateralism. That's why it's important to have this conversation about this UN Day. That's why it's important to go on to have a conversation within this unique ecosystem, but also, of course, with public and citizens all around the world.
Okay, you have a very interesting position as the head of the United Nations in Geneva, and you have access to the world of diplomacy really in the City of Peace, the City of Human Rights, and the many multilateral organizations that are here. So I guess my question to you is, and people might want to know, what is it that member states are telling you, and maybe how is multilateralism today different to how it was back when the United Nations was formed?
We know that multilateralism is under attack. And we have seen it before the pandemic, during pandemic, but at the same time, it's very important that all the member states, they feel their attachment to multilateralism. In spite of many conflicts, in spite of many challenges, all the member states understand that we need more multilateral cooperation. And we hear this message from the member states. Of course, all the member states tell us that we have to be more effective, that we have to be, I would say, more modern. We have to answer to the challenges. Quite a number of member states are talking to us about the future of modern conferencing. Geneva is the international hub of intergovernmental conferences. You know, under normal times, we have more than 10,000 of international conferences a year. Even within this period of pandemic, we had thousands of conferences, virtual and hybrid. And we hear the message from many member states. Let's think together how this world of intergovernmental conference will look after the pandemic. We all understand and we learned our lesson from the pandemic. We can work within virtual space, but nothing can replace in-person meetings.
What is it that you think personally about the United Nations? What should it be doing really for you to fulfill your ambition for the United Nations to help everybody on the planet?
I've been working with international organizations practically all my career. I've been working with the United Nations as an organization before. But now being within the United Nations, leading United Nations office in Geneva, it's a great privilege, but also a great responsibility, because I know that people are looking at us. They are looking at us as an example. And the results of the conversation said that they want more multilateral, they want more effective United Nations, and we have to deliver. So for me, it's important, together with all of my team, together with my colleagues here in Geneva, exactly to show that we can build up this new spirit of Geneva, new spirit of multilateral cooperation. We can really show that here in Geneva, we all can work together, that we can find solutions. We can find solutions to delivering sustainable development goals. We can find solutions to prevent the climate catastrophe. We can find solutions to fight poverty, inequality. We can find solutions to fight for human rights. We can find solutions for not allowing women and girls to be discriminated in the world, etc., etc., etc. So for me, it's a great privilege and a great responsibility.
The Director General of the United Nations in Geneva, Tatiana Valavaya, there, with a message of resilience and the need to look ahead to ensure that every part of our multilateral system is involved in building back better from the COVID pandemic, to help everyone on the planet. Now to our next studio guest, Volker Turk, who's a key member of the UN Secretary-General's team and who played a key role in the drafting of our common agenda. For those who are perhaps unaware of the report's significance, I wondered, could he explain what sets it apart from others by the UN chief?
So first of all, it really goes back to the 75th anniversary of the United Nations that we had last year. So it was born out of a declaration that came from all leaders of the world asking the Secretary General to produce a report that advances our collective common agenda of humanity and planet to address present and future challenges. That's where it comes from. It differs from many other reports of the past because among the hundreds of reports that are written every year, it is the report that looks to the future. It looks to the future of multilateralism. It looks to the future of how to engage with peace, with the economic system, with climate change, with the triple planetary crisis. It also engages with young people and with future generations in a more significant way than ever before. It basically gives you a 360 view of the world, of the state of the world. And that's really with a lot of recommendations how to make sure that we come to a breakthrough scenario rather than a breakdown scenario.
But let's just drill down a little bit. There's this call that commentators have picked up on, concrete proposals for a renewed social contract. What's the reasoning behind this and how realistic is it?
Well, the social contract is really where the glue comes together between the citizens, the people who live in a society, and the institutions that are supposed to serve them. What we have seen in many settings, both in the global north and in the global south, is a fracture between the people and the institutions, the governments that are supposed to serve them. So how do we rebuild it? How do we make sure that it's renewed? How do we make sure that institutions serve the people that they are supposed to serve? But also how do we make sure that future generations and the voice of young people is listened to and heard in the decisions that are taken today? Because we know, as we saw from climate change, that whatever decisions are taken today have huge implications for the future.
You were talking about the world's youth, and this new blueprint for multilateralism contains proposals that intend to include the needs of our future, the world's young people, in tomorrow's multilateralism. Perhaps you could tell us a bit more about them.
So we had a fantastic process of preparations when we drafted the Common Agenda report for the Secretary General, and involving very much young people. We had 7 next generation fellows that engaged with youth groups in 40 countries, reaching hundreds of young people who thought about the Common Agenda. They wanted to make proposals, and they made proposals to the Secretary General of what they feel is important for their lives. Of course, it's around climate change. It is around education. It is around vocational training. It is about the future of work and the digital world. And the Secretary General was extremely interested in listening to them. And a lot of their ideas are actually he wanted us to make sure that their ideas are reflected in the report.
So with that in mind, our Common Agenda is really the start of a process, and it'll be interesting to see how it will be implemented and what the next steps are. What insight can you give us about that?
So it will be important that we, within the UN system, are committed to its follow-up. And I have to say, I'm so impressed by the enthusiasm that I see among UN colleagues. I mean, they really embrace the report, and it's both at the top level, but also in the ranks and files, and that's fantastic. But it's also interesting how it lands with member states. We heard during the general debate of the General Assembly about 53 leaders referred specifically to the report, welcomed it, despite the fact that it had just been issued. And you know, it's a long report, it's a long read. So we were very happy to see that so many leaders around the world pick up on it, want to see it advance. And so we hope that there will be enough momentum created for the future, especially for the summit of the future that will take place in 2023, to actually get real decisions out there that change the trajectory in the world today.
I guess final question would be what you see personally as the greatest challenge, having been so key to producing this Common Agenda. You know, you've really got your finger on the pulse of what it is that the UN needs to do to reform and what people want from member states to the world's youth. What do you see as the next big step for the UN to take?
I think for us, I'm really very encouraged by what I see internally. So I'm not worried about how we are going to advance it within the organization. I think we will have a lot of discussions and engagement with member states, with other actors, with the civil society, with in this multi-stakeholder framework. But we also see a lot of tensions among member states. And we really hope that the report is almost a phoenix from the ashes as a product that actually brings people together, that shows the interconnectedness and overcomes some of the trust issues that we see currently play out among the membership.
My thanks to Volker Turk, and now to our next guest, Professor Alana O'Malley, who's Chair of United Nations Studies in Peace and Justice at the University of Leiden and at the Hague University of Applied Sciences. So thank you very much for joining us today, Professor O'Malley. My first question, of course, is about the report entitled Our Common Agenda, presented by UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres in September 2021. It starts with a very strong opening. We're at an inflection point in history. In our biggest shared test since the Second World War, humanity faces a stark and urgent choice, a breakdown or a breakthrough. Do you agree with this statement? Because the UN has already faced many challenges in the last 75 years. What makes this one different?
I think this is a different inflection point in history, and it's certainly a turning point for the UN. And what makes that different is the global context in which we're operating. So I think the parallel crises of the global pandemic and climate change, which of course exacerbate each other, have emphasized for everybody in a way that the global community, the global world, the global system has not experienced before, both the hyper-connected nature of our international society and also the essential role of international organizations like the UN to provide assistance, but also to manage global crises on this scale. So this is very different than previous historical moments in the last 75 years, because that context is really unprecedented.
Thank you. And challenges moving forward. Today, the main question is, can we continue with business as usual, risk significant breakdown and perpetual crisis, Or are we going to make a concerted effort to build an international system which will deliver for the people and the planet? Now, as an historian, Professor O'Malley, you're familiar with the phrase inflection points in history, so perhaps you could tell us more about how challenges in the past have helped us move forward and what you think we need now for the international community to face up to the challenges that you've just outlined.
Well, inflection points in history and in the history of the UN have been marked specifically by two phenomena. And the first one is that oftentimes the UN has been, in my view, mischaracterized or misconceived as being paralyzed at these moments of crises, when actually, if we look at those moments of crises, take, for example, the crisis that struck in the Congo in the 1960s when the UN intervened in defense of sovereignty for the first time, or take, for example, the genocide in Rwanda in the 1990s, where, of course, the UN failed to act swiftly enough, but later we had the birth of the responsibility to protect doctrine. So in both of these incidents, what we see is that the UN develops new competencies and new functions because of crises. Now, what's important about this inflection point in particular is that the UN has a new and kind of reinvigorated connection to the global public. And we see especially the role of traditionally marginalized actors coming to the fore. And they've come to the fore previously in the past in those two incidents that I mentioned. But particularly now we see the role of global South nations being very vocal and important on the current crises, and also young people. And the UN's inflection point now is to embrace more closely those traditionally marginalized actors in order to move forward in a more productive sense.
And on the same point, can we look for elements of hope in the history of the UN? In what way can the history of the organization and perhaps its predecessor help us move forward?
You know, the history of the UN is characterized by this idea that it's either a passive talking shop for the Western powers, where it doesn't really represent most of the views of the rest of the world, or this idea that it's fairly ineffective, that it doesn't really achieve anything. But actually, you know, you have to consider what happens beyond just looking at Security Council politics. And history shows us the enormous humanitarian achievements and accomplishments that the UN has made in 75 years. I mean, the World Food Programme feeds 85 million people in 75 countries. So these are significant achievements. And so what the history of the UN in a full sense shows us is that actors like those from the global South actually have paved new pathways and new competencies in the UN system to expand its function and its agency, and to help it to be more representative, to be more efficient, and to be more effective in the work that it carries out.
Thank you. Final question to you then. This is on the Common Agenda itself, and you'll certainly have heard the Secretary General's speech at the General Assembly recently when he was talking about this, and it's based on the 4 principles of strengthening global governance, focusing on the future, renewing the social contract, and ensuring that the UN is fit for a new era. So what is there in those key elements there that's new, in your opinion?
I think the best thing that comes out of that agenda is what the Secretary General promises, which is a revision of some of the mandates and systems of the UN itself, and also leadership on these questions. And that's what's been lacking for so long, is that we really have had kind of an absence of leadership at the top levels of the UN, and also among the member states. So if the countries that spoke so eloquently at the General Assembly in September about multilateralism, if they really substantiate that by kind of providing that leadership at the UN, I think that's very important. And again, we saw, interestingly enough, a lot of very important rhetoric and a lot of important speeches on this coming from small countries like Ireland, who was president of the Security Council, and also Jamaica. I think that was one of the most memorable speeches. And so we see again the role of smaller nations being very important in paving the way for the UN to develop its competencies and its functions and its effectiveness. So hopefully the Secretary General will take account of that as he tries to put this report into action.
Professor O'Malley there from the University of Leiden and the Hague University of Applied Sciences, asserting that yes, the United Nations is indeed at a turning point today because of the multiple challenges before us. You're watching a special UN Day 2021 programme for the 24th of October 2021 to celebrate the entry into force of the UN Charter in 1945, which led to the official establishment of the United Nations and which ushered in a new era of rules-based international cooperation, multilateralism. And now to our next guest, Dr. Youssef Nassef, who's Director of the Adaptation Division and Chair of World Adaptation Science Programme at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. Dr. Nassef, amid rising concentrations of greenhouse gases year on year, what do you think the biggest source of emissions is today that can be reasonably tackled?
Well, indeed. I mean, we're on the cusp of a decade of transformation where we have to institute systemic shifts, especially in the energy sector. So the question of where is the biggest source of emissions is certainly in the energy sector. Fortunately, renewable energy is now cheaper than traditional energy for new installations. So that's where I think we have the low-hanging fruits in order to stimulate that transformation.
Let's now talk about the need for a holistic approach to tackling climate change. Is it your belief that current policies are sufficiently all-encompassing to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050?
Well, there's two dimensions to that question. I mean, one is the actual pledges that we have seen. And we have nationally determined contributions provided by each country, and we see that these pledges alone are insufficient. So instead of reducing emissions by 45% by 2030, we have an increase in emissions by 16%. Beyond that, the policies are not sufficient. So since the Paris Agreement came into play, we've had $4 trillion of new investment in fossil fuels. So obviously there's a mismatch between commitments, between the global orientation, the consensus, and the actions going ahead. So what's needed here is a whole value chain transformation for the policies to work, all the way from information, from awareness, from education, to how we incentivize and disincentivize using fiscal policies and otherwise the direction of investments, which currently are moving in the wrong direction, all the way to the consumer, the person making the decision of what to spend on what. So that's awareness again. So yes, the policies are insufficient. They're not all encompassing because we keep focusing on one area, a certain pledge for a certain sector, a certain area of emissions, without tackling all the rest of the chain that makes it possible or enables it or challenges it from being implemented. So certainly we need to do more in that regard.
Thank you. Now, on to adaptation and resilience. It's certainly true that climate change requires both adaptation and resilience. Can you tell us more about what this means, how countries should assess what they need to do and which needs are more urgent than others? Who needs it in particular? And I say that because, of course, we've seen that richer nations haven't been spared the devastation of wildfires and floods.
You rightly pointed out that even in developed countries, there have been impacts that have materialized and their capacity to adapt, their resilience was insufficient. So it's not just a matter of money, but a matter of applying the necessary policies, of having good early warning systems, of having good monitoring systems, systematic observation that need to be instituted as a holistic model, as a holistic set of relationships in order to enable us not just to counter climate change, but to counter biodiversity loss, to counter things like Covid-19. So that's the holistic view of resilience, where we want our societies to not only try to minimize harm, but to have a formula to thrive in the face of these challenges, but in a way that is consistent with our development aspirations. So that's the new model of thinking of adaptation and resilience as we move forward.
It's awfully ironic that those who are most in need of this help are the least able to help themselves, and they need the most multilateral cooperation. They need more international solidarity, don't they? So perhaps you could tell us on that note about the kind of initiatives that have been taken by the United Nations to promote climate action more wholeheartedly, and also about the Resilience Frontiers initiative that you happen to be involved in.
Yes. Well, we realized after the adoption of the Paris Agreement that it's a pledge and review system. So countries pledge what they can do, and then it gets reviewed afterwards by the international community in 5-year chunks. So we have a climate action area of work where climate champions from the COP presidency, the presidency of the Conference of the Parties, will try to engage with the different entities, with businesses, with NGOs, with civil society, with municipalities, in order to institute more ambition, so that then creates a groundswell of ambition that then creates the whole country's level of pledge. But we're also going towards thinking of the future, applying foresight methodologies to look at what does a resilient world look like post-2030, and how can we look at the transformation in technology, the techno-economic paradigm that's changing as we speak, with AI, with Internet of Things, with big data. And that's the function of the Resilience Frontiers Initiative.
Given that we've had this COVID crisis, we continue to have the pandemic, and it's prompted many people to reconsider how to gauge our vulnerability, the need for early action and a rapid response. Do you think that the world's recovery and this need to build back better might present new opportunities to tackle climate change?
Yes, I mean, beyond the obvious, which is as we build back our health services better to react to such external shocks more easily, that has a benefit for the types of shocks we will face with climate change, which includes pandemics and includes diseases such as dengue, yellow fever, and malaria in particular that would prevail beyond their current areas of prevalence. But beyond that, we've learned a lot in how the public has perceived types of crises that have immediate observable effects versus those that have a longer term time span. And also how the public responds more to crises where they can see the effect on them individually and personally. And that's helping us change the narrative of climate change. So we're changing the narrative to make it clear to the public how climate change will affect them personally, will affect their families, and departing a bit from the doom and gloom scenario to show, okay, here's the light at the end of the tunnel. If we adapt properly, if we increase our resilience, if we mitigate, if we move towards a new sustainable paradigm with zero emissions, here's how your life will be massively better.
Dr. Nassef there drilling down on what building back better actually means, and if it's done successfully, how it could bring about radical and positive changes in cleaner energy production. To our last guest now, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Suri Moon, co-director at the Global Health Centre at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. Professor Moon, thank you for joining us today. Now, given that your research focuses on the dynamic between global governance and public health, it makes sense to ask you about COVID-19. The pandemic has reminded us how interconnected and interdependent the world is. So, in your opinion, what are the great lessons we should take from the international response to the new coronavirus?
Thanks very much for having me. I think one of the big things that we saw very clearly illustrated in the pandemic was the enduring power of national sovereignty. Basically, we saw countries kind of closing in, looking in on themselves, certainly in the early months of the pandemic, and that the arrangements to ensure that there was international cooperation were much weaker, actually, than the power of sovereign states. And I think this is something that scholars have debated for a long time, to what extent is sovereignty eroding? And what we saw in COVID was that it's here to stay.
Okay, so given that massive shift in geopolitics and the way that sovereignty may have shifted moving forward, we've heard the COVID-19 pandemic described as a wake-up call to the world. But do you think it can create momentum for better global health governance, given that there are many ongoing chronic problems from conflict to economic inequality, climate change, and migration, for example?
I think that's indeed the trillion-dollar question on the table right now. And certainly COVID-19 has been a wake-up call. Without health, we really don't have anything else. We can't provide education. We don't have economic activity. We don't have national security. I think the importance of health has certainly been elevated as never before. I do think that we have seen big ambitions for what we can do through international cooperation. But in terms of the reality, unfortunately, it's a bit more bleak. And I think one of the things that we've seen, we can use the case of vaccines as a great example, one of the things that we've seen is a real fragmentation, that despite big global ambitions to ensure that everybody in the world would have equitable access to vaccines, the reality today is tremendous, gaping inequality between the poorest and the richest countries. And what we've seen is really fragmentation, that countries don't come together to globally cooperate anymore, but they do cooperate at regional level. They do rely on their geopolitical relationships with allies. They do rely on, of course, their own domestic financial and industrial capacity, for example, to get access to vaccines. So one of the big questions, I think, coming out of this pandemic is there still an appetite for grand global solutions, for universal multilateral cooperation, or are we going to see in the future kind of a fallback to regions and to clubs, to minilateral governance, as it's been called?
So, Professor Moon, how do you see the role of the UN system for public health in future?
I think the United Nations and the World Health Organization in particular remain absolutely central as a place where countries and other stakeholders come together to actually negotiate the rules that govern the globe. And I think this is a function that has been relevant in the past, but it's going to become increasingly important because of the fragmentation in how we will actually operationalize those rules. So, for example, going back to the vaccines, what we need is for all of these countries and for all countries of the world to come together and to negotiate rules so that in the future we can have a more equitable system for access to vaccines. Commitments, for example, to share technology, commitments to share supply when supplies of vaccines are short, as they have been over the last 18 months.
Thank you very much. And that issue of intellectual property has never been more important. Perhaps you could tell us more about your research, because I know it's one of your special areas.
Thanks very much. I think it's a really relevant issue right now, and I think it also illustrates this trend of fragmentation that we've seen. Perhaps in the past, developing countries would have relied more heavily on wealthy countries, on development aid to get access to vaccines. But we hear today a very different message, which is that many developing countries want to produce for themselves and have the technological, industrial, and financial capacity to produce for themselves, and in fact are already beginning to do that. It's not only China and Russia, which I've mentioned, but also, for example, Mexico, Brazil, India, Indonesia, many countries now want to produce for themselves, but they want to make sure that global intellectual property rules will not block them or slow them down from doing that. And so agreement on how we manage intellectual property, making sure that countries have the knowledge that they need to produce and supply vaccines to themselves and their neighbors, has become more important than development aid, for example.
Now, final question, the importance of partnerships, because today it seems that non-state actors such as civil society, academia, policy networks, think tanks, the private sector, and many other newly formed alliances are becoming key actors of private-public partnerships in the field of global health. Professor Moon, can you tell us more about the role of these partnerships today and the emergence of this inclusive multilateral cooperation in the field of global health?
The multilateral system has become more inclusive, certainly to non-state actors, as we call them. And there's a lot to be welcomed about this increased openness to many different societal stakeholders. But we haven't perhaps given enough thought to what are the different roles that these actors can and should play. So I think we need to move and to a kind of a global governance 2.0 to become a bit more sophisticated in our thinking. This has already happened at the level of the WHO, where there is a relatively new framework for engagement with non-state actors, as it's called, where we try to differentiate among these different groups of stakeholders. But I think we can even go further than that and move to kind of a global governance 3.0, which might be even more inclusive. And here I would say we need to have much more emphasis on transparency of information, because today it's not only organized groups like NGOs or business associations who might have a stake in global governance processes. It's really everyday citizens. But these everyday citizens need information. They need information in order to be informed participants in these debates. And this is where I think we have much further that we can go within the UN system in developing more robust, open transparency policies so that everybody has the information that they need in order to participate effectively.
Professor Suri Moon there with a frank assessment of sovereign states' fragmented multilateral response to COVID-19, and interestingly, the growing call from developing countries not for development aid, but rather for new skills that will help them withstand any future global health threat on their own terms. And that brings us to the end of this special UN Day 2021 programme. Thank you very much for joining us and for following the work of the United Nations. For more programmes from the UN, take a look at our YouTube catalogue, and don't forget you can watch many of the meetings that happen here on webtv.un.org. Bye-bye.